You trusted him. He shaped your childhood, gave you wonder, safety, magic. But what if the man behind the mouse wasn't who you thought he was? FBI informant, possible anti-Semite, a ruthless businessman with a smile. Walt Disney built your dreams by controlling the story. Now it's time to tell ours. On December 5th, 1901, in the Hermosa district of Chicago, Illinois, United States, a child was born who would later be known to the whole world by the name Walt Disney. His father, Elias Disney, was the son of the first Irish immigrants who settled in Ontario, a part of British Canada in the early 19th century. In the 1870s, Elias's family left Ontario for California with the belated hope of making a profit from the ongoing gold rush in that state. But the golden dream quickly faded. Instead, they accepted an offer to become farmers in Kansas. There, Elias. Then a young man began trying his hand at orange farming. But that effort soon failed, forcing him to leave, moving from one job to another throughout the late 1880s and 1890s. Most notably was the period when he worked on the railroad. Eventually, Elias settled in Chicago, where he became a building contractor. Walt's mother was Flora Call, who carried English and German blood. She had been a student at a school in Kansas, where Elias once came to substitute teach for his sister for a short time. From that meeting, they quickly developed feelings for each other and married in 1888. The couple had 5 children, of whom Walt was the 4th. The eldest, Herbert, was born the same year they married, 1888, followed by Raymond in 1890, then Roy in 1893. It wasn't until 1901 that Walt was born, and 2 years later came the youngest daughter, Ruth, born in 1903. Throughout Walt's childhood, the Disney family continuously moved houses. In the mid-1900s, a neighbor living near them on Tripp Avenue in Chicago was broken into and had their grain store robbed. The incident caused Elias, a conservative and strict Christian, to decide that he could not let his children grow up in a city full of crime. The family immediately moved to a 40-acre farm located outside the town of Marceline, Missouri, where one of Elias's brothers was living. There, they grew fruit trees and various grains. But farm life was harsh, and before long, Walt's 2 older brothers, Herbert and Raymond, had left, returning to Chicago to find work. By 1911, the whole family once again moved, this time to Kansas City. There, Elias had bought the distribution rights to the newspaper, the Kansas City Star. In the following years, Walt and his brother Roy had to wake up at 4 a.m. every day to deliver newspapers, then go to school for a long day of study. This harsh schedule seriously affected Walt's academic performance. The boy was always tired and distracted, yet, in that very difficult time, a passion emerged. Walt began to love drawing. He was fascinated by the idea of creating cartoon-like characters and gradually stepped into the world of animated image creation. Later on, that would become the foundation for the person he would become. Disney grew up in an era when mass entertainment, especially for children, was changing profoundly. For a long time, people had been fascinated by forms of performance, where a small group performed and a larger group watched and enjoyed. That could be stage plays, theatrical comedies, or traveling circuses. All were forms of live entertainment, moving from town to town, bringing laughter to the crowds. One of the most famous shows of the early 20th century was Buffalo Bill's Wild West, a traveling performance infused with the color of adventure and legend, highly popular among the American public. But the world was changing rapidly when Walt Disney was still a young boy. Since the mid-19th century, there had been dramatic advances in the technology of capturing images, and especially the ability to turn still images into motion. Not long after, the area of Hollywood in northern Los Angeles, California, became the new capital of the film industry. The reason was simple. Natural sunlight was the most important factor for filming at that time, and California offered both abundant sunlight and a mild year-round climate. Around the same time, some pioneers in the field of motion pictures began to conceive a bold idea that an ancient form of art animation could be brought to the screen. Since the mid-18th century, illustrated story strips had appeared in newspapers, and now people began to imagine turning hundreds of those drawings into animated films by making them move continuously, frame by frame. The first major milestone came in 1908, the hand-drawn animated film Phantasmagorie, created by French artist Émile Cohl. At that time, Walt was only 6 years old, but this brand new art form left a deep impression on his mind, and later, on the entire history of American popular culture throughout the 20th century. By 1917, the Disney family moved again once more, returning to the late 1890s. When they still lived in Chicago, Elias Disney had invested in a company called Ozell, which specialized in producing apple juice and canned jams. In its early years, the company performed quite well, and by the mid-1910s, Elias's shares had grown large enough for him to secure a seat on the board of directors. This was the reason the family moved back to Chicago. Upon returning to the Windy City, Walt got a job at McKinley High School's newspaper drawing cartoons. But inside, he was burning with eagerness. At that moment, the United States had just entered World War I, and Walt also wanted to enlist. However, he faced a major obstacle. In December 1917, he had just turned 16, too young to register. Undeterred, Walt forged his birth date on documents to apply to the Red Cross as an ambulance driver in France. When he arrived in Europe in November 1918, the war had already ended, though he didn't experience the battlefield as he had hoped. He still stayed in Europe for a short while before returning in 1919, carrying with him a new passion. During his time in France, Walt continued to draw, this time for the U.S. Army's Stars and Stripes newspaper. It was here that his love for art was strongly rekindled. After returning to the United States, Walt found work as an illustrator at an advertising company in Kansas City, where he had lived from 1911 to 1917, the period that shaped his teenage character. And it was in Kansas, in the late 1910s, that Walt met someone who would change his life forever. At the Pesman Rubin Commercial Art Studio, where he was taking additional art classes, we befriended another young artist, Ubbe Ert Iwerks, the son of a German immigrant, a few months older than Walt. Ubbe, who later changed his name to Ub Iwerks, had endured an unhappy childhood. His father abandoned the family when he was very young. A deep friendship quickly formed between Walt and Ub, bonded by a burning passion for art. They were not only kindred spirits, but also professional partners. Both left the Pesman-Rubin studio to establish their own studio, while still taking part-time work from companies like the Kansas City Slide Company. And it was this combination of Walt's creative ambition and Iwerks's technical brilliance that laid the foundation for the dazzling future successes of the Disney empire. Right from the beginning of their collaboration as animators, Iwerks quickly developed a new technique. He attached a motor to the animation camera, simplifying the process of rapidly flipping static drawings to create smooth motion scenes. At the same time, it was also Iwerks who played a key role in designing the character of Mickey Mouse. This in no way diminishes Walt's contributions. On the contrary, he was the driving force behind the founding of the company that bore his name. It was Walt who, together with Iwerks, established several companies in Kansas and took on the role of managing their business operations. In the summer of 1923, he also made the crucial decision to leave Kansas and head west to California to establish an animation studio in Hollywood, which had become the center of the rapidly growing American film industry by the mid-1920s. There were two main reasons behind this decision. Previously, his older brother, Roy, had moved to California, hoping the warm climate there would help treat the mild tuberculosis he had. Walt soon reunited with Roy, and together they founded Disney Brothers Studio, beginning their journey of producing animated films. Although this was initially a joint effort between the two brothers, Walt, who had experience in animation, gradually took the lead in creative direction and strategy. Not long after, the company was renamed the Walt Disney Company. Soon afterward, Walt reconnected with his old friend Iwerks and persuaded him to come out west. It didn't take long for the artist from Kansas to agree. They continued operations by producing the short film series Alice Comedies, a combination of live-action footage and animation. However, not long after, Disney and Iwerks began creating a character that would become far more famous. When Walt arrived in Hollywood, the film industry was entering a period of profound transformation. Since the mid-1910s, film studios had sprung up like mushrooms in this area as pioneers in cinema sought out a location with year-round favorable weather for filming, and also to escape the tight control of inventor Thomas Edison, who monopolized film technology on the East Coast thanks to his patents. In those early days, all films were silent, but not long after, creators began experimenting with adding music and sound effects to films. Once technology made it possible, from there, adding dialogue became the natural next step in film's evolution. And in 1927, just a few years after Walt set foot in California, the first film with synchronized dialogue and songs was released. It marked the birth of the talkies, the name used at the time for sound films. By the 1930s, talkies had become the new standard in Hollywood film production, the animated films. Walt Disney also followed this general direction. In the 1920s, they primarily focused on innovations in visuals and sound effects. Dialogue only truly became a central feature in the 1930s. What set Disney apart was not the format, but the level of success they achieved. Meanwhile, Walt's personal life also saw many changes. In 1923, a woman from Idaho named Lillian Bounds, 3 years older than Walt, moved to California in search of job opportunities. Not long after, she took a job as a secretary at the newly established Disney studio. There, she and Walt began a romantic relationship, and on July 13th, 1925, they were officially married in Lillian's hometown. It was Lillian who suggested the name Mickey Mouse for the character Walt and Iwerks co-created in 1928, after he told her, on a cross-country train ride from New York back to California, that he was considering the name Mortimer Mouse. Their marriage was not entirely smooth. The couple struggled for many years to have children, and by 1931, the prolonged distress had led Walt to suffer a nervous breakdown. After a period of recovery, they finally welcomed their first daughter, Diane. In December 1933, the result of multiple miscarriages Lillian had endured. They had no other biological children, but in 1936, the couple adopted a baby girl just a few weeks old and named her Sharon. To the public, Sharon was always regarded as their biological daughter. However, Disney's family life was not always peaceful. To his relatives, Walt often appeared as a distant figure. He had a habit of retreating into a private room in his mansion, where he had designed and installed a massive toy train that could run on tracks nearly half a mile long. At the same time, Disney was also a deeply sentimental man. Years later, when building Disneyland, he named one of the train cars Lily Bell to honor his wife's role in the creation of the legendary icon, Mickey Mouse. The journey to creating the character that would later become Mickey Mouse began in 1927. At that time, Disney and Iwerks had completed the Alice Comedies series, the main revenue source during the studio's early days. But they needed a new project, a new stream of income. Charles Mintz, the head of Winkler Pictures, had proposed to Disney that Universal Pictures, one of America's oldest film studios, was planning to launch an animation division and was looking for a character to kick things off. Initially, Disney and Iwerks considered creating a character based on a cat, but soon realized that this image was already too common in animated films at the time. So they shifted toward the idea of a rabbit. After several weeks of intensive work, the result was the birth of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, a black and white rabbit with an upright figure, the direct predecessor of Mickey Mouse. However, the first short film featuring Oswald, Poor Papa, was rejected by Universal. Undeterred, Disney went on to create a second film called Trolley Troubles, which Universal was very pleased with and quickly ordered more. In total, Disney produced 27 short films featuring Oswald, generating significant income from Universal and providing a solid financial foundation for the young studio. By that time, their staff had grown to around 20 people, while Walt, Roy Disney, and Iwerks were proving themselves to be brilliant entrepreneurs. The Disney family also invested part of the profits in oil drilling ventures. Meanwhile, Iwerks, always the one with a technical mind, used his share of the profits to start a side business manufacturing and selling ink and paint for fellow animators and cartoonists like himself. Oswald the Lucky Rabbit was the catalyst for the creation of the most iconic character Disney ever made. In early 1928, Walt and his wife traveled to New York, where he had an important meeting to negotiate a more favorable profit-sharing agreement for producing additional episodes featuring Oswald over the next 2 years. However, the deal did not go as expected, and on the train ride back to California, he began to think about a new character, one that Winkler Pictures and Universal would not be able to own the commercial rights to. As they had done with Oswald, Disney envisioned a new character with a shape similar to Oswald, but distinct enough to avoid legal trouble. At first, he intended to name it Oswald Mortimer Mouse, but it was Lillian, his wife, who convinced him that Mickey Mouse sounded cuter and catchier. Upon returning to California, iWorks brought to life the image of Mickey Mouse, exactly as we know him today. iWorks' role must be clearly acknowledged, although the idea came from Walt. It was Ub who breathed life into the character's form. Soon afterward, Disney and iWorks set to work on producing the first short animated film featuring Mickey. The initial version was Plain Crazy, a short animation starring both Mickey and Minnie. However, the test screening failed, and they had to start over quite literally. The result was Steamboat Willie, a work considered Mickey Mouse's official debut. It was also one of the first animated films to use fully synchronized sound, a breakthrough at the time. Steamboat Willie ran for just under 8 minutes, beginning with Mickey acting as the pilot of a steamboat, constantly clashing with Captain Pete, a large cat-like character. Minnie Mouse also appeared, trying to catch up with the boat, and Mickey helped her aboard. In the end, Pete punished Mickey by forcing him to peel a pile of potatoes. Throughout the film were cheerful music and lively sound effects created by the characters themselves, though there was no real dialogue, aside from a few lines from a parrot. With a budget of about $5, Narin Day, Steamboat Willie caused a major stir. When it was screened, audiences were thrilled. The film officially premiered in New York in November 1928 and was quickly released widely. It was warmly received by both critics and audiences, paving the way for Mickey to become a symbol of an entire era. In 1929 alone, 12 Mickey short films were released, and the studio continued to capitalize on his immense popularity throughout the 1930s. Counting merchandise, licensing, and other commercial factors, it is estimated that Mickey Mouse has generated nearly $200 billion for Disney over the course of nearly a century since 1928. In 1929, Disney began producing a new animated series called Silly Symphony. At first, these were humorous shorts built around specific songs, but soon after, they were expanded into longer, more substantial productions. Between 1929 and 1939, about 75 Silly Symphony films were created. One of the most notable works was Three Little Pigs, released in 1933. What's remarkable is that in this case, Disney was no longer producing works featuring characters created by iWorks. In fact, Ub Iwerks had left the company in 1930 after a serious conflict arose between him and Walt. Walt's personality was not always pleasant. His harsh attitude toward iWorks, who had been an indispensable factor in the company's early successes, had strained their relationship. And instead of using iWorks' original characters, Three Little Pigs was based on an old folk tale dating back at least to the mid-19th century. This was the period that marked a turning point in Disney's creative model. where fairy tales and folk legends were revived in a completely new form. Instead of staying faithful to the originals, Disney chose to reimagine medieval and early modern stories in a way that catered to the tastes of modern children. The film Three Little Pigs was a prime example, though it cost 22s to produce. The film earned over $250, an enormous figure for its time, and won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film in 1934. The phenomenal success of The Three Little Pigs, along with a string of other shorts during the late 1920s and early 1930s, sparked in Walt the bold idea of producing the first full-length animated feature in history. He began to share this ambition with his closest collaborators, while also searching for a story strong enough to serve as the foundation for such a groundbreaking project. Among the candidates were Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, two ancient Greek epics, along with Gulliver's Travels by Jonathan Swift. But in the end, Disney chose Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, a famous fairy tale systematized by the Brothers Grimm in 1812. Based on Central European folk legends, a silent film adaptation of the story had previously been released in 1916. Determined to pursue the project, Disney set to work on the animated adaptation with the goal of releasing it for Christmas 1937. He personally appeared in the promotional trailer, introducing the Seven Dwarfs characters. When the film premiered, Snow White instantly became a box office phenomenon, grossing more than $8 million in 1938 alone, making it the highest-grossing animated film adjusted for inflation in history, a record it held until Aladdin was released in 1993. This resounding success was recognized by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences with an honorary Oscar in 1939. In its tribute, the Academy described the film as a significant screen innovation which has charmed millions and pioneered a great new entertainment field for the motion picture cartoon. Following Snow White's success, Disney decided to bring Carlo Collodi's 1883 children's novel, The Adventures of Pinocchio, to the screen. The film was released in 1940 under the title Pinocchio and quickly drew attention. However, Disney's adaptation significantly altered the original. Collodi's work, the pen name of Carlo Lorenzini, was a biting satire of post-revolutionary European society and the consequences of industrialization. In the original, Pinocchio was not a sweet child. He even killed the character, Jiminy Cricket, by throwing a hammer at him early in the story. Geppetto, the woodcarver who created Pinocchio, was also portrayed as short-tempered and unfriendly. When the puppet came to life, it immediately kicked him. Later, he sold his only coat to buy books for Pinocchio, who then sold them on the way to school. While the original emphasized the chaos and failure of educational and moral systems, Disney's version removed that tone entirely. Jiminy Cricket, once a minor character swiftly discarded, was elevated by Disney to the role of trusted companion and moral guide to Pinocchio. Lorenzini's harsh messages were stripped away, making room for a heartwarming, accessible, and family-friendly storyline. Even so, Pinocchio was an artistic triumph, becoming the first animated film to win an Oscar, including the award for Best Music. However, in terms of revenue, the film fell short of expectations, largely due to the outbreak of World War II in Europe. Although the United States remained neutral, the American economy had already begun to feel the ripple effects. During the pre-war years and the early phase of World War II, Disney made several controversial choices. Notably, in December 1938, a delegation from Germany, including the infamous director Leni Riefenstahl, was invited to visit Disney's studios. She was the director of two of Nazi Germany's most renowned propaganda films, Triumph of the Will, 1935, and Olympia, 1938, which documented the party rallies and sporting events symbolic of Hitler's regime. The question of whether Riefenstahl was a devoted Nazi or merely an artist serving the regime remains a subject of unresolved debate. Nevertheless, Disney's decision to welcome a film crew from Nazi Germany at that time sparked a wave of criticism, highlighting the complexity of his choices during a highly turbulent moment in history. Riefenstahl's visit to Disney took place just a few weeks after international newspapers were flooded with reports about Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, when thousands of Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues in Germany and Austria were destroyed under orders from the Nazi regime on the night of November 9th, 1938. Riefenstahl's tour of the Disney facilities sparked controversy as soon as the news spread in December 1938. The company claimed that they had no knowledge of her connection to the Nazi Party and would not have welcomed her had they known. However, some have since speculated that Walt was fully aware of the visit and may have even arranged it, partly because he wanted to negotiate broader distribution of Disney films in Europe, and partly because he needed to resolve a significant debt owed to Disney's film distributor in Germany. This was not the only incident that led to accusations of anti-Semitism against Disney. His views on race remain controversial to this day. It is still possible that Walt genuinely didn't know who Riefenstahl was, or why her presence was controversial. The theory that this was simply a misstep gains more traction when considering the chaos in Walt's personal life at the time. Less than 2 weeks before the German director's visit, Walt's mother, Flora, had died of carbon monoxide poisoning on November 26, 1938. The tragedy occurred at the home in North Hollywood that Walt and his brother Roy had purchased for their parents. The family had previously complained about a leaky furnace, but at the time, nearly a century ago, awareness of the dangers of odorless CO gas was still very limited. Walt's father, Elias, was also severely affected by the incident, but he recovered and lived 3 more years, passing away in 1941 at the age of 82. After Flora's death, the relationship between Elias and Walt deteriorated. Elias seemed to blame his son for his wife's death, and when he passed away, Walt did not return in time for the funeral, as he was on a business trip and refused to cut it short. Flora's death, at the age of 70 left a deep emotional scar on Walt, because he was the one who had purchased the house where she died. He seemed to carry a lasting sense of guilt. Those who were close to Walt later said he became more hardened and withdrawn after the tragedy. At the same time, some believe that the absence of motherly figures in many Disney films of the 1940s, 1950s, and 1960s reflects unresolved wounds in his heart tied to the loss of his beloved mother, As previously mentioned, 1938 marked a clear rise in Nazi aggression in Europe. By 1939, tensions peaked when Germany invaded Poland, prompting Britain and France to declare war, marking the beginning of World War II. The United States did not enter the war immediately, though President Franklin D. Roosevelt openly supported aiding Britain to the fullest extent, while maintaining an official stance of neutrality. It wasn't until December 1941, after Japan, Germany's ally, attacked Pearl Harbor, that America formally joined the conflict. This period brought considerable financial hardship to Disney. Although the U.S. remained out of the war during its first 2 years, global economic instability forced the U.S. government to tighten spending. This directly affected cinema attendance and lowered Disney's revenues. At the same time, the European market had nearly collapsed. The situation became even more complicated as Disney Studios prepared to sell shares over the counter in March 1940. A stepping stone toward a broader IPO and official stock exchange listing in 1957. In the lead-up to the 1940 stock offering, the company implemented a series of labor reforms aimed at cutting costs. However, this caused deep dissatisfaction among employees. Many were forced to sign contracts agreeing to a 40-hour work week, even though they routinely worked much longer hours. At the same time, they felt that their creative contributions were not being fairly recognized. Wages for ordinary employees at Disney remained very low. All of this discontent finally erupted in May 1941 when the studio's animators launched a strike that lasted 4 months. At first, Walt chose to confront the movement aggressively, attempting to suppress it, but in the end, despite his personal wishes, he was forced to accept improved working conditions and to recognize the employees' right to unionize. However, amid this chaotic period, there was a bright spot for Disney: the return of Ub Iwerks. He and Walt had reconciled in 1940, and from then on, Iwerks would remain with the company for a long list of major projects over the course of more than a quarter century. The period in which the United States remained neutral during World War II, from 1939 to 1941, also saw Disney release a groundbreaking film, though commercially, it was not very successful. At least in the beginning, that film was Fantasia, released in 1941. The idea for this project was quite bold for Disney at the time. It was inspired by the poem The Sorcerer's Apprentice by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, the great German writer, poet, playwright, and scholar, written in 1797. Originally, the piece had been planned as a short film within the Silly Symphony series, but as production costs kept ballooning, Walt decided to turn it into a feature-length film to justify the investment. And so Fantasia was born. The film featured Mickey Mouse as the sorcerer's apprentice and was essentially an animated opera where classical masterpieces by Bach, Stravinsky, and Beethoven were performed by conductor Leopold Stokowski and the Philadelphia Orchestra. With a runtime of nearly 2 hours, Fantasia is now regarded as a masterpiece from the early era of animation. Stokowski received an honorary Academy Award for the music, while Disney was honored for the unique combination of classical music and colorful fantasy, all seen through the lens of Mickey Mouse. Although praised by critics, Fantasia's financial success was modest. Combined with the turmoil from the 1940-1941 strike, Walt began to realize that he needed to adjust his course, especially as America was preparing to enter the war. The situation was truly worrying. Fantasia had cost $2-3 million, a massive sum at the time, while other costs were also rising due to internal instability. So, Disney decided to sign a series of contracts with the U.S. government during the war period. Just weeks after Pearl Harbor, hundreds of U.S. Marines were deployed to Disney headquarters in Burbank to protect the nearby Lockheed aircraft production facility, which the government feared could become a target if Japan launched further attacks on the West Coast. More importantly, Disney secured several lucrative government contracts, producing both propaganda cartoons and educational films to support military training. Starting in 1942, as soldiers were deployed to North Africa, Europe, or the Pacific, Disney's films became a part of their physical and mental training programs. One of Disney's most memorable wartime symbols was Donald Duck. This character, originally introduced in a Silly Symphony short in 1934, now became the face of the company's wartime spirit. From 1942 to 1945, Donald appeared in numerous animated films. The most notable was Der Führer's Face, in which Donald plays a factory worker in Nazi land, worn out by forced labor, miserable food rations, and constant salutes to sudden images of Hitler flashing down the assembly line. That film, along with The Yankee Doodle Mouse, starring Tom and Jerry, won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film during the war. These works not only boosted public morale on the home front, but also helped Disney maintain financial stability during the most difficult years. However, Walt never gave up his artistic ambitions. Even during wartime, he quietly continued working on the films that had begun before 1939, waiting for the world to return to peace. One of the most notable films was Dumbo, the story of a baby elephant kidnapped and named Jumbo Jr., who was mocked as Dumbo because of his enormous ears. But it was Dumbo who ultimately triumphed, learning to fly using those oversized ears. The project had been initiated in 1939, but only after Fantasia failed financially did Disney decide to complete Dumbo in order to cut losses. They downsized the production to save costs, and as a result, when the film hit theaters in 1941, it ran for only 64 minutes. A year later, Bambi was released, a touching story about a white-tailed deer facing the harsh tragedies of life in the wild. The film was based on the novel by Felix Salten, an Austrian Jew, published in 1923. Though Bambi was always praised, many critics later pointed out that Disney had nearly erased all the deeper political messages of the original book, an allegory that reflected Jewish fear in an increasingly anti-Semitic Europe. This further intensified the controversy surrounding accusations that Disney held anti-Semitic views and became a prime example of how the company had sanitized 20th century culture, turning everything into pure entertainment. Meanwhile, Donald Duck was about to be relieved of saluting the Führer or working on the assembly line. World War II ended in Europe in May 1945, and Japan surrendered 4 months later, after 2 atomic bombs were dropped on the country. When the war ended, Disney had to enter urgent negotiations with the Bank of America for financial support, as the company was carrying millions of dollars in debt. Eventually, a deal was approved, largely because the bank believed Disney was a fundamentally strong company that just needed time to recover from a double crisis: the Great Depression and World War. Production temporarily slowed as Walt and Roy shifted to making nature documentaries and a few low-budget live-action films, genres more likely to yield profit. It wasn't until the early 1950s that they officially returned to animation. But when they did, they made an immediate impact. Between 1950 and 1953, they released Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. 3 blockbusters that redefined the Disney brand in a new era. The period from 1945 to 1955 can be seen as a crucial financial turning point that shaped Disney's long-term success. For Walt personally, it was also the decade that made him a millionaire. As the company flourished, he amassed a massive fortune, estimated at around $100 million by the time of his death, equivalent to several billion in today's dollars. But Walt didn't achieve that simply through friendliness or charm. On the contrary, he was famously cold and distant, even toward his own wife and children. A workaholic, Walt was not an easy person to work with. He very rarely praised employees. To him, no complaints meant good enough. If he was truly satisfied, he might say something short like, "That's good." Still, he was fiercely loyal to talented staff, always willing to give generous bonuses once the company recovered. But on a personal level, he often remained emotionally inaccessible. Staff frequently witnessed his unpredictable temper, and even with his brother Roy, who had financially supported him from the beginning, Walt showed little appreciation. At times, he regarded Roy as merely an accountant, not a co-founder of the company. Also during these years, Walt played a notable role in the wave of Red Scare and the Hollywood blacklist. Just as World War II had ended in Europe, the Cold War erupted as both the Allied powers and the Soviet Union vied for control over newly liberated European territories. Meanwhile, in the U.S., from the late 1940s through the 1950s, society was gripped by fear of a fifth column, the belief that the Soviets might have planted agents deep inside America itself. Many government officials and politicians began to express caution toward Hollywood, a place long known for its clearly left-leaning tendencies, and where quite a few people had openly sympathized with communism. Not long after, this legitimate concern quickly transformed into collective hysteria, triggering a wave of unfounded accusations. And among the first to speak out was Disney. As early as 1941, he had written an article in Variety magazine, blaming the strike by Disney animators on communist influence. By 1944, he became one of the founding members of the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization established to prevent communist propaganda from seeping into Hollywood films. By 1947, when the House Un-American Activities Committee officially began a series of hearings targeting the film industry, Disney appeared alongside a very young Ronald Reagan. There, he stated that some of his colleagues in the industry might be communists. From the late 1940s to the early 1950s, Disney also acted as an FBI informant, although the specific nature of this role remains disputed. Some evidence suggests his main task was producing educational films for the government. For Disney, the post-war era was not only a time of political engagement, but also a period marked by major innovations in technology and media. When the Disney studio was first established in the 1920s, film, especially animation, was mostly shown in theaters or on a few limited television channels. Television technology was still in its infancy then, developed by pioneers like John Logie Baird, the Scottish inventor who introduced the first TV set to the market in the 1930s. However, it wasn't until after World War II that television became truly widespread, appearing in households across the United States. And only in the early 1950s did television signals become strong enough to be broadcast nationwide. Disney was among the first to quickly embrace this new wave of technology. In 1955, he launched the Mickey Mouse Club, featuring the now iconic mouse-eared caps. The show ran until 1959, then was revived during the 1970s. Many people will remember this show not only for its familiar imagery, but also because it launched the careers of future stars like Britney Spears, Justin Timberlake, and Ryan Gosling. However, the more immediate and important impact was that Disney had fully grasped the potential of television as a content platform. Disney Channel was later launched in 1983, marking the company's bold transition into the cable television era. Throughout the first half of the 1950s, most of Disney's attention was focused on a revolutionary project, one of the greatest ambitions of his career. As early as the 1940s, Disney had envisioned a place where both adults and children could come to enjoy entertainment that went far beyond the traditional amusement park model. That inspiration stemmed from hundreds of letters. He had received over the years letters asking whether the public could tour the Disney studio in Burbank, California. However, he quickly realized that opening the studio to thousands of visitors was impossible. Instead, he decided to create an entirely new space, a Disney-themed amusement park. Initially, he planned to build the park next to the Burbank studios, but soon realized that the current area was too small to fulfill his dream. So, he purchased a 160-acre plot of empty land near Anaheim, in Orange County, California, where he began construction of Disneyland in 1954. Disneyland officially opened in the summer of 1955, with its centerpiece being Sleeping Beauty Castle, inspired by the magnificent 19th century Neuschwanstein Castle in southern Germany. Although Disneyland's grand opening was a weather disaster with melting asphalt, high heels sinking into the pavement, and non-functioning water fountains, the park quickly became a pop culture icon. In 1959, during his state visit to the United States, Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev made a rare request to visit Disneyland, but the wish was denied due to security concerns. Khrushchev was furious. In a scathing statement, he declared, "This situation is simply beyond imagination. I can't find the words to explain this to my people." Even though Walt Disney was deeply immersed in running Disneyland for most of the 1950s, that didn't stop his studio from producing a string of cinematic masterpieces. In 1955, Lady and the Tramp premiered. Unlike many typical Disney films, often based on fairy tales, this one drew from a modern short story titled Happy Dan, the Cynical Dog, written by Ward Green and published in Cosmopolitan magazine in 1945. The story follows Lady, a pampered cocker spaniel raised in an upscale home, and her unlikely romance with a streetwise stray. 4 years later, Disney returned to the world of fairy tales with Sleeping Beauty, adapted from the 1697 version by Charles Perrault, though often associated with the Brothers Grimm. This tale dates back to medieval times, rich with elements of classic magic and enchantment. By 1961, Disney went back to the world of dogs with 101 Dalmatians, based on the novel by Dodie Smith. The plot introduced the now legendary villain Cruella de Vil, whose terrifying scheme was to turn the Dalmatian puppies into a luxury fur coat. It was up to the heroic dogs Pongo and Perdita to act, and in the end, they saved all 101 puppies. In 1964, Disney released a film produced directly by Walt himself, distinctly different from most of the studio's prior hits. It wasn't animated, but it was still aimed at children and retained the magical spirit typical of Disney. Mary Poppins was a musical comedy directed by Robert Stevenson, who had made his name back in the 1930s with King Solomon's Mines. The film starred Julie Andrews as Mary Poppins, the ideal nanny who arrives to care for the children of George Banks. Played by David Tomlinson, she's joined by Bert, her cheerful and whimsical friend, played by Dick Van Dyke. The story follows Mary's unexpected arrival at the Banks household, and how, through her upbeat personality and magical touch, she slowly transforms their lives. The movie ends with an iconic scene. Mary Poppins, having completed her mission with the Banks family, quietly flies away with her umbrella. That image not only left a deep emotional impression on audiences, but became one of the most enduring moments in cinematic history. The film became an instant hit, grossing $44 million domestically, an enormous number for the time, and surpassing $100 million worldwide. Mary Poppins won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Actress for Julie Andrews, and was the highest-grossing film of 1964. To this day, it remains the most successful live-action film Walt Disney personally produced. In the early 1960s, Walt Disney began envisioning a project so bold it stood apart from every movie or theme park he had ever created. It wasn't just a business idea to him, it was a vision that could shape the future of humanity. That project was called Epcot. Today, many people, especially those who have visited Walt Disney World in Florida, are familiar with the name Epcot, experimental prototype community of tomorrow, one of the resort's most prominent theme parks. But few realize that before Epcot became the entertainment destination it is now, Walt Disney imagined something entirely different, a real-world prototype community of the future, where technology, urban design, and human life would blend into a seamless, ideal ecosystem. Walt Disney didn't want to build another theme park. He wanted to create a real city, carefully designed, where innovation, technology, and community would coexist in harmony. The project would feature residential housing, transport systems, workplaces, and commercial centers, all functioning as a model for the modern world. Disney considered various locations from Niagara Falls to St. Louis, but ultimately, the year-round sunshine of Florida drew him to Orlando. By 1965, he had quietly acquired over 27,000 acres of land, an area twice the size of Manhattan, to bring this dream to life. Walt Disney once dreamed of building an ideal city on this very land, a self-contained urban dome, powered by a public transportation system running on monorails and organized around a futuristic city center. At its heart would be a massive international hotel and a world-class convention center. From there, green belts would ripple outward, leading to residential areas where he aimed to blend the post-war appeal of the suburbs into a carefully planned community. Every resident of this future Epcot would work within the area, and their homes would be constantly updated with the latest technologies as soon as they became available. However, this was never meant to be a democracy in any form. In this vision, Disney would be the absolute ruler, a supreme leader, running the city like a corporation, a king tasked with keeping the machine running smoothly with no dissent allowed. It was a company-run government, and although that vision was never realized, at least not in the way he intended, the name Epcot remains well known today, albeit for a very different reason. By the late 1960s, Disney had begun developing a vast new resort in Orlando, which would later become Walt Disney World. The area officially opened in 1971, starting with the Magic Kingdom, the first highlight of the sprawling entertainment complex. Before his death, Walt had already drawn up plans for the site, and in his early designs for Epcot, he imagined that most of its residents would be employees operating the Magic Kingdom. In 1982, Epcot Center finally opened, becoming the second theme park at Walt Disney World. While it wasn't truly a city of the future, Epcot retained many design elements from Walt's original dream. Vast open spaces where global cultures were vividly recreated, immersing guests in a worldwide journey. Later came two additional parks, Disney MGM Studios, 1989, and Animal Kingdom, 1998, completing an enormous entertainment ecosystem. Today, Walt Disney World is the most visited resort on Earth. With over 77,000 employees, it is also one of the largest private employers in the United States. And although much of this success came after his passing, the entire resort bears the unmistakable imprint of Walt Disney's vision. Tragically, Walt never lived to see the opening of Magic Kingdom, let alone Epcot or the parks that followed. Beneath the shimmering surface of the Disney brand, Walt carried a dangerously unhealthy habit, one he sometimes joked about darkly. He was a heavy smoker, particularly of unfiltered cigarettes, a habit that had taken root by the time he turned 60 kiawas. In 1966, after years of declining health, he finally went to see a doctor. The diagnosis was grim: advanced lung cancer. Though cobalt therapy had been in use since the 1950s, at the time, this illness was still virtually a death sentence. Within weeks, Walt's health deteriorated rapidly. He was hospitalized and never returned home. Walt Disney died on December 15th, 1966, just 1 week after his 65th birthday. One of his final works, The Jungle Book, based on the writings of Rudyard Kipling, was released in 1967 as a bittersweet farewell. Throughout his lifetime, he produced over 80 feature films and hundreds of animated shorts, leaving behind a monumental cinematic legacy. After his death, he was cremated, and his ashes were scattered in California. His brother, Roy Disney, took the reins of the company and saw Walt Disney World through to completion before passing away himself in 1971. One of the most dazzling highlights of Walt Disney's career was that he received more Oscar nominations than any individual in history, both before and after his time. And not only that, he also won the most. He, or the films he produced, received a total of 59 Academy Award nominations, starting with Mickey's Orphans, a 1931 animated short featuring Mickey Mouse, Minnie Mouse, and Pluto. Although that film didn't win at the 1932 Academy Awards, another Disney work that same night, part of the Silly Symphonies series called Flowers and Trees, became the first animated film ever to receive an Academy Award, and that was Walt Disney's first Oscar. From that moment until 1965, only 2 years, 1940 and 1963, passed without his name appearing on the nomination list. Throughout his career, he won 22 competitive Oscars and was awarded 4 honorary Oscars. The first honorary award came in 1932, recognizing his creation of Mickey Mouse. The second came in 1939 for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Uniquely, the Oscar that year was custom designed, featuring 1 full-sized statuette and 7 miniature ones, symbolizing the 7 dwarfs. In 1942, he received 2 more honorary awards, one for technical innovations in sound used in Fantasia, and another for consistent and outstanding quality across all his works. Many believe the 1932 Oscar should have been shared with Ub Iwerks, the close collaborator who played a key role in Mickey Mouse's success. After Walt's death, the Disney empire continued to grow. During the 1970s, the company expanded its presence on television. In the 1980s, Disney began releasing its first home video titles. The Disney Channel officially launched in 1983, just days after the opening of Tokyo Disneyland, the company's first theme park in Asia. The path of global expansion continued with Disneyland Paris. And even in 1988, right before the Cold War ended, a Disney Film Festival was held in the Soviet Union. During these years, Disney kept producing hit movies and TV series. Notable among them, Splash, 1984, starring Tom Hanks, the Mighty Ducks franchise in the 1990s, and the animated mega-hit The Lion King, released in 1994. However, one of the most revolutionary milestones came in 1995 with the release of Toy Story. Not only did it become a massive success and launch a long-running franchise, with a 5th installment slated for 2026, it was also the first feature-length film made entirely using computer animation. For many at Disney, those who still cherished the art of traditional hand-drawn animation, the arrival of Toy Story was both thrilling and bittersweet. And the story didn't end there. In recent years, Walt Disney has continued expanding its reach, acquiring Marvel Entertainment in 2009 and Lucasfilm in 2012, which meant they officially became the owner of the entire Star Wars cinematic universe. Just after celebrating its 100th anniversary, Disney now stands as one of the 3 largest entertainment conglomerates on Earth, alongside Comcast and Sony, according to several global rankings. Walt Disney, without a doubt, remains one of the most influential figures in the history of modern popular entertainment. His legacy, from Mickey Mouse to enchanted theme parks, from classic animated films to a massive cinematic empire, continues to live on in the hearts of millions around the world. Walt Disney began his career as an illustrator and cartoonist in the American Midwest, working as a teenager in the late 1910s. Even then, he nurtured the ambition to create something far greater beyond mere advertising sketches or short animated reels for other people. In 1923, he made the leap westward, landing in California, where Hollywood was rising fast as the new heart of American cinema, even before the age of talking pictures. There, he founded what would become the most successful animation studio in Hollywood history, the birthplace of iconic children's characters like Mickey Mouse, Donald Duck, and Goofy. At the same time, he reimagined a host of fairy tales collected by the Brothers Grimm and 19th century folklorists, as well as modern literary works, into legendary films like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Fantasia, and Cinderella. Of course, we must not overlook the contributions of iWorks and many other collaborators. And it's no surprise that Walt Disney himself became a controversial figure. His decision to invite Leni Riefenstahl, the Nazi regime's propaganda filmmaker, to tour the studio in 1938 is a prime example of poor judgment. Disney himself was often described as difficult and rigid in many personal relationships. In addition, some critics argue that under his leadership, Disney's works helped over-Americanize global culture. For example, Bambi, originally a profound novel by Felix Salten, was turned into a film stripped of its political depth, and Disney's The Jungle Book led many to falsely believe it was Rudyard Kipling's defining work, when in fact, Kipling's true literary masterpiece was the novel Kim 1901. Despite these controversies, it's undeniable that Walt Disney was a man of vision far ahead of his time. His bold ideas for Disneyland and later Epcot are testament to that. People like him, though often difficult to understand on a personal level, leave deep, indelible marks on the world, and Walt Disney was undoubtedly one of them. What do you think about Walt Disney? Was he simply the man the world remembers? The artist who gave us timeless childhood stories? Or do the revelations about his political views and personal nature cast a shadow over his legacy? And has the Disney image been tarnished, not by the man himself, but by the corporate greed that came after? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Thank you so much for staying with us till the very end.